Hi, Lisa Maricosis, founder of Global One Health and Global One Fitness. In this video, I want to talk about a very important structure, and that is the lateral hip complex. So while we talk a lot about glutes, and of course glutes are the largest muscle group in the body, we do want them to be very strong, as the glutes are prime movers and prime stabilizers depending on the movement and the exercise that we are doing. So I think the glutes get a lot of attention, but we want to talk about a different aspect of the glutes. But the area I'm going to address comprises something a little bit more than just the glute musculature itself. So the glutes actually are three muscles that comprise that group. The glute maximus, which is the primary one, hence the name Maximus, is the largest of the three, but probably the most well-known, right? That is the back of the booty. That is the largest and the most powerful of the three glutes. We also have the glute medius, which is in middle in size, and the glute minimus. Now, the glute medius is probably best known as it is a lateral muscle, but it's also predominantly used to do hip abduction, but it also contributes a little bit to external rotation. But I also want to talk about the other muscles that comprise external rotation or that do external rotation in the hip. They are very important stabilizers in squats, in deadlift. Obviously, those are some of the two biggies and most famous perhaps, but in many exercises, in lunges, in a lot of Pilates and many Pilates exercises, in planks. All right, so you really need to know how to activate your glute muscle group, and also the stabilizers of the hip structure, including the external rotator muscle group. So in talking about that, we're going to actually use a band because it is the best way to strengthen and to specifically target this particular muscle group and muscle area. I'm not going to say area because I'm going to put the band on above the knees. Muscle area because the glute muscles comprise their own specific muscle group, whereas the lateral rotators or external rotators comprise a different muscle group. So when using a band around the knees, all of these exercises can be done without the band. And the first couple exercise drills, I've already demonstrated the basic fundamentals of how to do a bridge and how to do marching. That is in a previous or a different video, so you can certainly check out the basic things to think about when you're doing those drills. But I am going to incorporate those drills because we still want to be talking about strengthening the hip structure. But we're going to also talk about how to address getting more load and more activation and more recruitment from the front and back side of the hip as well as the side. So talking about the ways to strengthen the rotator structures of the hip and the abductors of the hip. Clams, probably one of the most famous and most commonly used exercises in training to strengthen that structure, but also very commonly used in physical therapy situations as well. So I'm going to maneuver myself so that you can see. So the basic position is in a side lying position. Okay, now let's get to the specifics though. When in a side lying position, I don't want you, I'm going to just turn around for a second, to lie comfortably on your mat or on the floor as if you're in bed, right? So in bed, you kind of just get into any old position. You know, the rib cage is relaxed, your head might be forward. It's very important when you're doing all side lying exercises that you activate all of the trunk muscles, right? Obviously, we talk about activating the core, specifically the abdominal wall. And I mentioned many times that muscle group wraps around 360 degrees around the trunk. So we don't just want to think about pulling the stomach muscles in from the front. We want to get those side muscles activated, especially the side that we're lying on. So I don't want to be in this relaxed waist position. I want to be using the muscles of the underneath side, the side I'm lying on. This whole muscle structure needs to be engaged the entire time you're doing these exercises for the hip. So the lateral side of your transverse abdominis, your ab wall, and also the obliques, which we haven't talked too much about those yet, but we will. The obliques, internal and external, also on top of that ab wall in terms of muscle layers, but you want this whole structure activated. Okay, so having that been said, there are a few variations. The most basic is you just have your bottom arm folded underneath your head. You can also be you'll see variations slightly like this. But again, I'm not resting. I am using my elbow and my little bit of that upper arm as leverage, pushing it into the ground to get activation of my side trunk muscles. From the back, it also is going to engage a little bit more or involve engagement of the lat muscle, right? So if I'm putting that elbow into the ground, I don't want to be like this. So I want to be engaged here, but if I go to that position where I'm slightly up on my elbow, right? Again, we don't want the ribs to relax. The whole structure, you can see the difference, right? With what I'm wearing, I want to be activating my lats and my teres major. All these little muscles and the big gun muscles of the rib cage and trunk are activated to support my shoulder joint if I choose to use this position. And then, of course, I could also be way up on the elbow, which is even more prep for a basic side plank. Again, this is not where we want to be. We want to support that shoulder capsule, so we have to use all the muscles that surround the shoulder joint to support it. So, I'm going to be in this position for now, so that you can see the trunk is staying up, but the leg position, that's also important to talk about, right? Classic position is you are in the chair pose. So if my spine is in a straight line going this way, I want to be in a chair pose. Okay, I'm actually going to be here, right? So if I'm in a chair pose, right, my thighs are perpendicular to my spine, and the thigh bones are aiming straight forward, and my shins, lower legs, are parallel to my spine, perpendicular to my legs. So it's a 90-degree angle. It would look like chair pose. See how that chair pose is important? We simply are going to be in a side lying chair pose, 90 degrees at the hip and 90 degrees at the knees. So the first exercise is the clam exercise. I'm engaging my core. I'm engaging my side core as well and obliques, right? So I'm in chair pose position. Just going to let this top arm relax for now. And I'm going to do a clam exercise. So clams are basically, I'm lifting up the top knee and bringing it down. Okay. So when doing this exercise, notice my feet and ankles. A lot of times people come into this position, right? They lift the knee up and they do something with their ankle. So you don't want to, I don't want to really go into inversion of the ankle. I want you to just be aware. I like to do the variation where you're thinking about every part of the body, all the structures. So I'm staying in a nice dorsiflexed position. My heels are reaching outward away from my head, and I'm simply externally rotating the top leg. And notice when I come down, I'm not resting, right? I don't, especially depending on the band that you're using. These smaller round bands are ideal for this type of work. But if you don't have them, you can always take a long TheraBand and just simply tie it a little knot around the knees and use that as well. But this is ideal for this purpose. So when I do clams, my heels stay touching. Again, if I have a point of contact, if I push my heels actively into each other, I will get even a little bit more recruitment in the hip structure. I always like to tell my clients, keep a little bit of tension in the band so you're not resting, and because the resting kind of shuts the mind off, and then, you know, you get a little bit distracted. So the goal is to build endurance and try to keep tension and not be so quick. It's not just focusing on a big motion up unless that is your intention, but understand what your purpose is when you're doing the drill, right? So if you just want to do the basic rep, you go up and you control the down because that's your negative. You want to control the close and not have the band do more work than you, right? So this is the harder phase, but you still control the leg down. Now, if you want to do it quickly, you have to make sure you don't lose the integrity of the control. Now, you can do 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 reps per side. Now, a little add-on that I like to do at the end of the set is, we call them little pumps. You get the leg to the top and you just slightly, right, you're trying to focus on maintaining that end range activation to get a little extra burn and recruitment in that lateral hip and butt area. But the goal is, again, even the small range, you're controlling, right, the leg as much as you can. So those are the clam muscles, right? Chair pose, heels stay connected, and you're simply lifting up only the knee. We go to hip abduction. Now this can be done in a few variations, but abduction is I'm going to lift up my whole leg. So I'm not externally rotating because my knee is still facing straight forward like my body is, right? I'm still staying lifted on the waist, and I'm lifting up the whole leg structure, knee, ankle, everything. If I maintain a parallel position, I am doing abduction. I am simply opening up sideways. Again, same principles apply, controlling the down. I could take little pulses up at the top. Now, if I lift up my knee, not as high as my ankle higher than my knee, right, then this variation would be I'm working my internal rotators of my hip because I'm turning my thigh bone in. So we're always referencing specifically the hip joint structure in this series, right? So it's external rotation of the hip, internal rotation of the hip, abduction of the hip. Now, in terms of the abduction, ab, meaning away, right? You take away. So I'm taking my leg away from my midline. That's how I know it's abduction. So I could do that with my leg in 90-degree hip flexion and my knee bent. I can also do it with my leg straight and this way. So my leg is simply extended straight out in a parallel, same plane as my body and my trunk. Now, I can have my foot flexed, pointed. I can point and flex. I can raise on the dorsiflex on the raise, point in the bottom, or reverse. You can play around with your ankle positions, alternating every rep, every set, however you choose to do so. When I'm doing abduction, I can have my leg, again, straight in line with my body. I can have my leg extended forward, and then I can work abduction in hip flexion, whereas my leg is now on a forward angle in relationship to my body, or I can work in abduction in hip extension, and I'll show you what that looks like. I'll change sides. Right, so abduction and hip extension is if I'm lying straight down, right, I'm in a straight line. Now I'm going to bring my top leg behind me, so now, and I can go up and down. So I'm still working the abductor hip muscles, but I'm also involving or integrating my glute muscles, more of my glute muscles, I should be more specific, to get my hip in extension, which is where my leg is now behind the line of my body. So we talked about clams, hip abduction, straight, forward and back, and then I can also do internal rotation. If the foot comes higher than the knee, I am technically internally rotated at my hip at that point. So now if we want to just go back to a couple of the exercises that I had talked about, the marching and the bridges, we can simply use the band to get more recruitment and activation of the lateral glute structure using the band. So if I were to do bridges, right, we talked about getting onto the back, right, planting, quick review, tripod of the feet, arms reaching long, actively working. I can have palms down. I can make my hands into a fist and push my pinky sides of my fist into the ground without going into hyperextension. That'll create activation of the forearms, the triceps, the shoulders, the lats in a really nice way. So what I would do is I would be up into my bridge, but I would keep a little bit more tension on the band. I could turn a little bit this way, right? So I'm trying to stretch the band to get more recruitment than, right, I'm going to get a lot of recruitment in the back of my glutes as I do my bridge, but if I want to get a little bit more focus on my lateral glutes, as the glutes do wrap around from the back toward the side of the pelvis and hip structure, if I add the band, I will get a little bit more activation of the lateral hip structure. An important note I like to address, to put my feet more facing the camera, when I stretch the band, I don't just want to let my ankles roll out in any position, because then I wouldn't want to stand up and have my ankles rolled out, right? That wouldn't be stable. So we want to talk about, right, when I'm adding the resistance of the band, I still want to plant my feet down very much so that I'm trying to get that sense of not being here when I stretch the band, but keep my feet planted, right? So I'm focusing on keeping the inside edges of my foot structure and my ball joint. And if I really think about pressing the big toes down, the more I stretch out, I am getting more activation of the intrinsic musculature of the feet, which is very, very important. But also by keeping the feet planted and stretching the band more, I'm getting a little bit more of frontal plane activation or movement in my ankle joint structure, so that if you're walking on an unstable surface, a crooked sidewalk, you're hiking, you're in an area where the terrain has a little bit of a hill to it, or maybe there's a little pebble or a stone there, right? You want your ankle to be able to respond and be able to be reflexive in any position, any angle. So it's good to train the foot to stay flat and to stretch out, so you're not only just getting the activation and more recruitment in your hip structure and musculature, but you're also training the ankle to be able to know that it can move a little bit sideways and have a stable foot, right? Have the foot fully on the ground. So that is one more thing we talked about in the marching. If I want to just get, since we have the band on, marching was the exercise, right, going up into chair pose. If I add the band to it, it's just going to get more recruitment, right? I'm going to get a little bit more activation because marching is moving in the sagittal plane, right? I'm moving my legs forwards and backwards straight on, right? With the band, I simply get a little bit more activation in my hip flexor structure, right? As I come up and down, right? Or the second variation, if I go into the double march chair pose for marching, like we talked about, or I talked about in another video, here, I'm going to get some hip flexor work, more than without the band, but when I have both legs in chair pose, because now my leg is moving away from my body, I'm going to get a little bit more activation of the back sides of my glutes in the marching if I have the band on my knees. And finally, I can also do the book exercise if I open my legs sideways in the frontal plane, right? That same movement I did in a side lying position, I can do here on my back, which is going to load my core a little bit more than it will side lying. So a lot of times clients say they don't feel as much, they feel it's harder to recruit their abdominal wall when they're in a side lying position. So here, because my legs are in chair pose, I automatically get a little bit more load and demand on my front abdominal wall to work. So I'm really pulling that structure into the floor actively. And then if I open my legs sideways, I call this exercise book, show you a little bit from this angle, right? I'm simply opening at the same distance my knees and my ankles. But I haven't talked about book before because I feel you get a little bit more bang for the buck when you use the band for book, because now you're working that lateral hip structure. So I put this exercise in this video because I think it's really good to do that with the band to get more activation through there. So that covers a lot of these banded exercises that you can do to strengthen your lateral hip structure, but also get a little bit more activation through the whole glute complex, but also target your deep intrinsic lateral rotators of your hip structure that are very important stabilizers, again, as I mentioned, for squats and deadlifts, even though you want to be thinking about them in any standing exercises. You want to corkscrew your legs, just like we talked about corkscrewing your arms. We want to do a corkscrewing intention of the hip joint isometrically, because that's going to create more support and stability to the hip structure when under load in more advanced exercises. So you want to do these basic drills to strengthen the structure so that when you need to put more demand on the body in more demanding movement, you have those muscles, the ability to turn those muscles on and already have them strong and ready to work for you when necessary. So I put all the banded exercises kind of in one video so we can kind of target all of those. So I hope that proves helpful, and make sure you're corkscrewing the hip joint in all vertical loaded movement especially. Okay, so that's it for today for this one.